Factsverse presents… Is this the most useless plane ever made? The Wright brothers are the first people to design a functioning airplane. They had a lot of failures along the way, but they did manage to fly a plane successfully. Over the years, others have tried to come up with newer designs for airplanes, helicopters, hoping to get a leg up on the competition. In some cases, though, it was a complete disaster. Here are some of the biggest epic flying failures. The Fisher P-75 Eagle. Everything about this plane was supposed to be a success. It was supposed to be a symbol of victory because the number 75 in the name came from the French 75mm gun that was used during the Great War. The word Eagle was supposed to represent America's greatness. The plane's designer combined parts from better planes, but sadly the engine was a disappointment and its performance was underwhelming. The Douglas DC-10. The main problem with this plane is that it was prone to accidents. In total, it had 55 accidents resulting in numerous deaths. The plane's biggest flaw was that the cargo doors opened out instead of in. That's the opposite of most planes. Because of this massive flaw, a door flew open when the aircraft was in the air in 1972. And the same thing happened in 1974 and again in 1979. An engine fell off the wing while the plane was taking off. Many changes, fortunately, have been made to the plane since, and it is a lot safer today. The Bell FM-1 Aerocuda. This plane was developed in 1937, and it had a futuristic look. Many of its features were unconventional. The designer of the aircraft placed the guns and engines in a place where it would be easier to fire them. Unfortunately, the engine frequently overheated. Also, because of the rear propellers, the gunner couldn't bail out if they needed to. And finally, every time the guns were fired, the plane would fill with smoke. The Vought F70 Cutlass. This aircraft had a very interesting design. Rather than a traditional tail, the plane had a swept-wing design. And it had its fair share of issues, one of the biggest being the plane struggled to stay in the air. Not a good thing for an airplane. It didn't even have enough thrust to take off or land. Over 25% of the aircrafts made ended up crashing. The Convair NB-36. Nuclear reactors can start a nuclear chain reaction, and that's why nuclear reactors should only be used in nuclear power plants. For some reason, somebody in the 50s thought it'd be a great idea to attach a nuclear reactor to a plane. Now, the plane was considered to be so dangerous, a team of support aircraft followed the plane each time it took off. Because it was deemed that dangerous, the plane only flew 47 times in total. The PZL M-15 Belphegor. This plane was designed in Poland. It's the only mass-produced biplane ever built. The design was created in 1972, and the aircraft was meant to be used as a crop duster. Since it's very dangerous to make a crop duster with jet power, the idea didn't really take off. Also, these planes were a lot more expensive to run than the ones that should have been created for crop dusting. Is this the most useless plane ever made? A lot of people think so. The Wright Flyer. The Wright Flyer was the first powered, heavier-than-air machine to sustain flight with a pilot on board. The plane only flew 852 feet. On December 17, 1903, the plane only flew 4 times, and it never took off again because the plane was almost impossible to control. However, the Wright brothers proved flight was possible. That was the important thing, and it paved the way to make bigger, better, and faster planes in the future. The Yakovlev Yak-38. When the British Navy's Harrier jump jet proved how useful it was to have a vertical takeoff and landing, the Soviet Union tried to create one of their own. It was called the Yakovlev Yak-38. Unfortunately, their version failed miserably. It could only fly for 15 minutes, and only if it was hot outside. If the weather conditions weren't perfect, the plane couldn't fly. If they were perfect, it could only fly 800 miles. The only thing that actually worked well on this plane was the ejector seat. The Lockheed Martin VH-71. From an aeronautical standpoint, this helicopter was designed pretty well. It was made in 2002 by Augusta Westland and marketed to the U.S. The Marine Corps was so impressed with the helicopter that in 2005 they decided to use it. It was also chosen for presidential transport. It became Marine One when the president was on it. 4 years later, though, the cost to build just one of these jumped from $6.1 billion to $11.2 billion for one helicopter. Yeah, not worth the price. The Bristol 188. When Chuck Yeager used the Bell X-1 to break the sound barrier in 1947, other air forces wanted to do the same. The British jumped on board and they worked on their own research. They built the Bristol 188, but it was seriously flawed. Whenever the plane was flying, it would leak fuel. It could also not take off unless it reached 300 miles per hour. The Aerodrone. Samuel Pierpont Langley was a brilliant scientist and inventor. Way back in 1891, he wanted to design an aircraft that could fly more than just a mile. He also wanted the plane to be human-crewed. He built the Aerodrome, which had 52 horsepower and had the best power-to-weight ratio. The problem was that the aircraft never flew. During the first and only flight, it flew off its catapult and fell into the Potomac River. The McDonnell XF-85 Goblin. This plane was initially designed to be a parasite fighter. That means that it would be attached to a larger bomber during takeoff and then released during flight so that it could fight off other planes. The problem with this plane was that it used a .50 caliber machine gun which just wasn't powerful enough. Its enemies would quickly overpower it. The Lockheed XF-V1 Salmon. During the 50s, the U.S. military had a pretty big budget, so they were able to try and bring some of their crazy ideas to fruition. This was when they designed the Lockheed XF-V1 Salmon, which was designed to take off vertically. And that was a good idea, in theory. But taking off vertically meant that the pilots would need to land vertically and backwards. Also, the engine would often tear itself into pieces. The Grumman X-29. During the 1980s and 90s, the U.S. Air Force used the Grumman X-29A. This aircraft had a unique forward-swept wing. It was supposed to be helpful because the plane performed better at subsonic speed. Unfortunately, the design left the plane aerodynamically unstable. According to NASA, the plane was unflyable because it didn't have a digital flight computer on board that would have had to make corrections to the flight path 40 times per second. The Baade 152. This German plane was based on bomber concepts. It features a high wing and outrigger wheels on the wingtops. This was great for bombers, but not for airliners. The prototype flew only 2 times before crashing. The whole crew died, and the engineers later discovered the fuel lines stopped working during the descent. That caused engines to stop working. The Germans ended the project in 1961, and it became the only airliner made in East Germany. The Rockwell XF-V12. This plane was designed during the 1970s. You'd think that aviation experts would know enough by this point to avoid making a plane that didn't fly, but you'd be wrong. The plane looked fancy with its off-wing style. It also had a system called Thrust Augmenter Wing. It was supposed to take off vertically, but it never managed to leave the ground. The Concorde and the Tupolev Tu-144. These two supersonic airliners were designed in the late 70s. The Concorde became iconic, and the Tupolev was dangerous. The first passenger prototype crashed at the Paris Air Show. During that flight, 22 of the 24 central systems failed mid-flight, causing the plane to crash. Because 2 airframes were used, the plane was a complete failure. It took flight only 55 times before the idea was finally scrapped. The Dassault Balzac V. The idea for this plane looked great on paper, but in reality it was awful. The French hoped to create their own fighter jet that could take off and land vertically. Are you seeing a theme here? They got the inspiration from the Mirage 3 fighter. While the aircraft was in the testing phase, 2 pilots died. Still, the French continued trying to make the plane successful. After creating a new prototype, it also crashed. Fortunately, the pilot that time did manage to eject. The Havilland Comet. There are plenty of good things to say about this plane, which was the first jet-powered airliner. Unfortunately, the negative aspects outweigh the good. Soon it became an example of how not to design a plane. Engineers redesigned the aircraft plenty of times, but that still didn't prevent fatal accidents from occurring. Subscribe for more.